I once had the opportunity to sit in on a training course of a man whose military achievements far outweighed my own. Not only had he gone further and farther and shot faster than me, but he had quite a few laurels that he could have hung his hat on. And in the middle of the course, about the middle of the day, after we took the lunchtime break, he brought everyone back together and he was talking about how during the next section of the class, it was of vital importance that the students get in as many reps as they could. He was teaching a CQB class, and we were about to cover entering and clearing a corner-fed room and a center-fed room. This was room clearing 101 for these students. And so not long after he had explained that it was reps that was going to be the most important element here, he got into talking about points of domination, which is a term of something that we might even refer to as jargon within the community that refers to a certain method of clearing and in its own name, dominating a room. And as he was talking about it, about 15 to 20 minutes went by as he was explaining on how why you establish points of domination has to do with that it's related to an L-shaped ambush, which is the most effective form of an ambush. And as I was listening, I came to realize that he was not teaching the students anymore. He was arguing with ghosts, which is the subject of today's episode, and we're going to talk about one lesson about teaching lessons that we can take home. Now, this episode is sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and they are a company that, as I have said, represents many facets of gun culture. Whether you're looking for tools and equipment that are going to give you a little bit of an edge on the competition field or in self-defense, or if you are seeking after self-sufficiency and you've gotten started with gunsmithing and you know the importance of a good set of punches or assembly tools, go ahead and check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. They are first in best dressed when it comes to sponsoring the intellectual side of gun culture, and so they also have a service for you if you are in the process of taking an idea, an invention of sorts, and bringing it to real life. They might be the people for you. If you open up your safe or you look inside your gun room, you might find parts that you did not know were actually manufactured by Obsidian Arms. So check them out, support the show, go over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Now let's talk about arguing with ghosts. This is a subject that very quickly can stray into the abstraction and almost become a victim of its own explanation. And where I would like to start is, have you ever been a student in a course? And after a few minutes of listening to the instructor talk about something, come to realize that he's actually not trying to explain something to you. He's trying to convince somebody who is not actually in the room that he might know what he's talking about. It's not that the instructor himself isn't confident in what he does. It's not that he isn't knowledgeable in the skill set. It's that there seems to be some little demon sitting on his shoulder, some cadre in the catwalk above that he has to justify his explanation to as if they are the ones criticizing him. Or have you ever been in an instructing opportunity where you're teaching students and you snap out of a subject that you've been going down, this train that you've been riding downhill, and you look at the student in the eye and you realize that he's starting to glaze over a little bit. He's not quite lost, but he's still there. And you realize that the person that you've been talking to this entire time isn't even in the room to begin with. We might extrapolate this to that quote that is oftentimes attributed to Theodore Roosevelt, where it's not the critic who counts, it's the man who is in the arena, whose face is marred by blood, our dust and sweat and blood, and so on and so forth. But what I'm getting at here is that there seems to be a training scar about training that has infected a certain element of the gun culture. It's not universal, it's not everywhere, but like we as individuals who care about the well-being of one another, we might want to try to find a way to point it out in a way that isn't simply self-aggrandizing. When somebody is arguing with ghosts, I most oftentimes find them to be people who have served in the military. Now, this might be a sort of self-licking ice cream cone problem for myself, and that I can easily identify it because it's something that I'm familiar with, but I might not be able to identify it as easily in arenas that I am not as, let's just say, versed. However, I have a feeling, and I have a reason to believe, that it is not exclusive to gun culture itself. And this particular example, this particular case is different from other forms of criticism, other forms of being subject to criticism, or maybe other forms of being more too overly concerned about the critics than others, because it is specific to something that I've seen recreated over and over and over again. Let's stay on the subject of CQB. Something that you will oftentimes, or you might experience in any sort of military or professional, profession of arms type environment, is that individuals, especially when they get into some position of at least a junior position of authority, like a team leader or a squad leader or so forth, they oftentimes find themselves in a position where they have to justify their actions to somebody else. This happens very oftentimes in training, and once again, sticking to the field of CQB, what you might see is that right after a team has cleared through a shoot house, a special house built for teaching people how to do CQB, right after a team leader has led his team through clearing a shoot house, the cadre, the instructors, are asking him to explain why he did certain things, which is an interesting concept because, particularly, one thing that's specific to CQB is that the individuals who are participating in it are making hundreds of small decisions in a very short span of time. Each action, movement, step, and transition is ultimately a choice that can have consequences in how they enter the next room, how they clear through a certain area of the building, and whether or not they will be successful to begin with. We are dealing with a high-risk, high-stakes environment that is the close quarters battle of the modern world, yet what we're looking at in the training environment is when the person is doing the action, they're making all of these tiny decisions really, really, really quickly, and then somehow they're expected to, through that adrenaline, which is clearly going to be, or very likely going to be spiking through them, as that adrenaline is wearing off, they're expected to explain to somebody why they did what they did. Now, what you oftentimes see is that the person, after they've gone through the adrenaline spiking experience, doesn't remember all the things that they did. They don't remember all of the actions that they took because, well, that's kind of what happens when you do those things. You overload the mind with enough activities, and it's not going to remember everything that it did, much less what we had for breakfast today. And so, the instructor who, going back to the example of arguing with ghosts, is oftentimes, instead of a person who is engaged in the activity of arguing with ghosts from a military, in this kind of military example, might find himself no longer teaching the students who are right in front of him, and rather reverting to a prior habit of having to justify his actions to somebody else. The critic who isn't there, the critic who's in the imaginary catwalk above, the critic isn't the person that the instructor is most responsible to at the time. Rather, his duty is to his students. And so, what can he do about this? One thing that we should do when we look at how we are teaching certain subjects is remember that it's the audience that matters more. We want not only a good instructor is somebody who can take his student, assess his learning capabilities and positions and so on and so forth, and get him to the desired effect in a way that works for the student. And instead, what we've oftentimes run into is a lot of this baggage that gets dragged into the arena. That is the egos and attitudes of people who are no longer there. So I'm going to go back to the subject for those who are versed in the subject of CQB and talk about this idea of points of domination versus a strong wall or whatever. The reality is, we know what a room looks like. We know what a bathroom looks like and a kitchen looks like. We know what rooms look like. We know that a bedroom is not set up the same way as a bathroom or a garage, or so to speak. And while the principles of CQB might remain the same, it doesn't really help a student to explain terms of L-shaped ambush and points of domination all that well if all we're doing is teaching them how to learn the jargon to begin with. That might be helpful down the road, but it's not likely that that's what they paid you for to begin with. And so what we're looking at as a goal of teaching, and something that I think that we as instructors or those who are instructing can do better, is focus on the skill sets of the students and put to rest the criticisms that are outside the room. If you're going to deal with your critics, do not deal with your critics in front of your students. It does no one any good, and it's that time when a person's criticism is of the least importance. That should come afterwards, when you have time between classes to try to think about what are the justifications for certain actions and how to accomplish certain tasks. Then for those students who are in a class that they recognize that the teacher might find themselves arguing with ghosts, the best thing the student can do is not to gotcha or correct the instructor, but to ask him to demonstrate it. And so ask him if he can demonstrate it so that they can so that they can get in more reps. This goes back to the story at the beginning of this instructor who was teaching a CQB course, and for one section of this long conversation got caught up in the action of arguing with ghosts. The students lost time because they were listening to the man talk about something that wasn't really going to get them to their objective. What ended up becoming of that instructor, however, is that he went on to make some corrections in how he taught some things, and now is one of the best people that you can learn from in the country. He's one of those people that I want to be able to take a class with in the future, but it's only a matter of time, and we'll see when that can happen. And this subject of teaching and this subject of how to teach and what we're teaching comes back to the way that we approach our own gun culture. We all know that ego tends to be a problem in this industry, especially in anything that likes to refer to itself as the arena of alpha males or whatever. And that language and all that garbage that people have loaded it with has ultimately produced quite a bit of baggage where those who are incapable of putting away the critics find themselves in critical locations where they're incapable of performing because they've been further and permanently crippled by people who are not even or no longer relevant to what they're doing. That's why I like to use the term arguing with ghosts, because when it comes to military people, we oftentimes see these characters arguing with people who are not there at all, but might have had some influence over them in the past. So, in conclusion, if you ever find yourself in a teaching position and you find yourself distracted from the students and instead are spending too much time justifying justifying your teaching element, that should be a point to note and work on alone when you're not in front of students. That is a point of improvement, particularly for an instructor. And for students, remember that the context that a teacher is teaching in is important. So when people are mentioning their background, they might be referring to somewhere they've done or justification for their position, or they might be trying to provide context for you, the student, to consider what it is they're about to teach, why it might be relevant, and how it can be done. This episode on Arguing with Ghosts has been brought to you by Obsidian Arms, which is a pretty quick break into how we're going to wrap this up. If you want to support the show and if you want to be a part of the conversation, if you have questions about what are some teaching-related elements, put them in the comments below. I could really use a little bit of feedback from the audience here on things that, because there are these. Let me explain myself for this first. There are conversations that are going on behind the scenes, behind the screen, away from the camera, about not necessarily how we manipulate things, but what are the things that people within gun culture really are looking for. An example of this in training might be, what are the courses that students really want to take? 10 years ago, the idea of teaching a Battle Drill 1 Alpha class, or a how to knock out bunker, or how to knock out, or how to clear a trench, or how to react to combat, break combat, or react to contact, break contact, or so long and so forth. These battle drills that can be found in the Ranger Handbook. The idea of an instructor putting on that course would have been laughable. That was the same time when the idea of putting on a civilian CQB course was unthinkable to the culture at the time. But we don't live in that day and age anymore. So if you want to move gun culture forward, if you want to have some participation in it, leave a comment down below on what are some classes that you would like to be taught that you would see as value to yourself and to the gun culture as a whole that you could take and you would take. Please don't put some 6-month Ranger School-esque class, because that's going to cost you, roughly $25 million or something like that. Some unbelievable amount of money. And because I think if I recall right, the cost of Ranger School, sending one student through Ranger School 10 years ago was, I think, $60,000. So that's pretty cool. But that being the case, leave a comment down below on what training scars you've seen amongst trainers and what kind of classes you'd like to see in the future. If I can't put it on, maybe I'll find somebody who will. That being the case, if you want to support us here at the Redacted Culture Cast, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. You can get it on a discount code with our shop there, which is going to make it worth its time or worth its cost immediately. Or you can head straight over to redactedllc.com, pick up one of our hoodies that are on pre-sale right now at time of recording and time of release of this episode, or some of our other goodies that we're dropping all the time. And then finally, that being the case, thank you so much for your time. Go forth and conquer.